Welcome to Backlash Unfiltered, a podcast series by UNRISD. Through in-depth conversations with leading scholars, activists, and policymakers, we will explore the rise of anti-gender movements, their impact on social development, and the historical and geopolitical forces that sustain them. This series is not just about understanding the backlash. It is also about resilience and imagining a fairer future.
Hello and welcome to Backlash Unfiltered. I am Karima Cherif, Head of Communications and Outreach at the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, and I will be your host for today's episode. Today we're joined by Lata Narayanaswamy, Associate Professor in the Politics of Global Development at the University of Leeds, UK, PhD in Geography and Anthropology from the University of Durham, UK. Lata's research critically explores gendered, intersectional, and post-decolonial dynamics within global development. Welcome, Lata.
Thank you so much for having me.
So in 2023, you wrote an outstanding, and I must say, top 3 most read working paper for UNRISD, together with Hailey McCuey, on the international anti-gender movement, understanding the rise of anti-gender discourses in the context of development, human rights, and social protection. In this paper, you explore the inner workings of anti-gender movements, their tactics, their reach, and their impact. But more importantly, you challenge us to think about how we can push forward and reclaim the narrative. So to pick up on some of the central themes of the paper, can you walk us through the historical roots of today's anti-gender backlash? How do colonial legacies shape the narratives we see today?
So first, thank you, Karima, for having me. And also that is a great question, because I think one of the things that we need to think about in terms of understanding what we're calling now this anti-gender backlash, I think the starting point is that gender inequality is baked into the way we live, right? So it's systemic, which means that capitalism absolutely depends on patriarchy. And specifically what that means is that it relies on all of the unpaid and undervalued reproductive and care labor that is crucial to the survival of the system. And the reality is that that work, right? It's work. It's unpaid and undervalued. That work is done disproportionately by women. Now, not surprisingly then, the pushback against gender equality as a kind of goal, as a kind of public policy objective, nothing new at all, right? So Susan Faludi used the term backlash to describe the oppositional response in the US to what were perceived as sort of feminist gains as far back as 1991, right? When she wrote about this. Now, historically then, at least partly, some of this idea of this pushback against broadly, women's rights or feminist movements has been allied, not exclusively, but substantially with different expressions of religious conservatism. Now, in terms of what Hailey and I were talking about in this paper, what we can see is that this changes with the global financial crisis that occurred in 2007 and 8. Okay, so feeding off the austerity, right? So that's the way we would describe the widespread reduction in global social protection expenditure. That resulted in a huge amount of uncertainty and insecurity. These anti-gender movements saw an opportunity to pivot away from the overtly religious entanglements that they tended to sort of assert to a much more mainstream message that effectively centered on the reassertion of patriarchy and the deeply entrenched gendered and racialized inequalities that underpin capitalism as a way to restore security and order in an uncertain world. Okay, so this has since become a message that has also swept up a wider group of conservative actors. So first, it's important to really understand that this isn't really just about old religious wine in new conservative bottles, if you like, to sort of use a metaphor. But scholars such as Paternotte and Peto and Kuhar and so many others have pointed out very eloquently, these are actually new and more diverse mobilizations, where the language of gender itself has become a sort of signifier of everything that, in the view of these anti-gender actors, is going wrong with the world. Right? So the reason that we're invested in gender equality is why everything else is not working properly. Now, what does colonialism have to do with this? Well, here it's worth being clear that we can point specifically to European and in particular British colonialism, which, let's not forget, at its height was the overseer for 425 million people and 1/4 of the Earth's surface, right? So it was hegemonic in that sense. And they were key to spreading what we could call specifically colonial Victorian ideals around the heteronormative patriarchal nuclear family, which is a fancy way of saying that there's an expectation that the normal thing would be that a man marries a woman and lives in a family with their own biological children, sort of in separate units. Okay. So central to both capitalism and colonial domination is the idea that wealth creation is sort of what happens in public, right? So the things that we count as economic, and that's masculine. And then the reproductive is private, or it's read as feminine, right? And that's unpaid. Now, the idea of the nuclear family then becomes a mark of civilization. So any cultures or societies that European colonists encountered that did not organize their societies in this way are considered barbaric. And this then acts as a retrospective justification for empire itself, because we're teaching them to be like us and so on. Now, by centering the family, what we also then have to do is almost by definition is to reject LGBTIQA plus identities, as these fall outside of these heterosexual male-female binaries. And the legal codes of the British Empire here are particularly important, because in the British Empire, acts against nature, so it was defined very broadly, were outlawed, effectively criminalizing any kind of same-sex relationship. Singapore only overturned this particular penal code in 2022. So it's cast a very, very long shadow. Now we can fast forward to the present day and we end up with a really interesting inversion. So since colonial times, it is true to say that there have been important advances in legal recognition for LGBTQIA plus people in many Western contexts. And this is a really good thing, right? We absolutely should be celebrating that. And sort of trying to, make sure that as many places have such protections and recognition. But what's interesting in the context of this thing we call development is that gender equality and sexual rights are seen as civilized and developed norms. And so then global South countries where these rights are not upheld are seen as backwards. And then in a further twist, these efforts to uphold sexual rights, gender equality and sexual rights in some global South countries are often critiqued as Western or a kind of neo-colonial imposition. And then their rejection emboldens religious and conservative coalitions in many global South contexts to claim they are fighting against gender equality or LGBTQIA plus rights to preserve local or indigenous identities under the pretense that these efforts are actually decolonial or anti-Western, which is sort of read as a good thing. So we get this very odd sort of contradictory mix, but in fact, in many places, it is the persistence of colonial legislation that has historically limited the right of people of diverse sexual orientation, gender identity, expression, and sex characteristics. And there is, in fact, nothing traditional or indigenous or anti-Western about heteronormative patriarchy either.
To move on the second question, like in the paper, you explain how these movements have now become increasingly strategic and well organized. So can you tell us in what ways have these anti-gender movements professionalized their advocacy, particularly in the global forum like the UN? And what are the mechanisms through which anti-gender advocates gain legitimacy in international policy circles?
Yeah, Karima, thank you for that. It's actually a great question because in some ways it's not obvious that these ideas would have so much traction. It is interesting, right? They have, as I've said, been around for a long, long time. So why are they actually gaining so much traction now? So there's a few ways that I think Haley and I set out to think about this. So the first thing is that we can think about the ways in which particular types of professionalized knowledge infrastructures, if you like, have emerged to support this mode of thinking, right? So that's think tanks, that's NGOs, and they have every kind of infrastructure that you'd expect from any kind of research organization. So they have academic fellows, they set up networks, they write papers and policy briefs. They will even run their own journal titles, published with reputable journal publishers. They'll feature special issue on special issue journal features. They'll write articles, and then they'll run conferences and events. And then these are integral to being able to function in a way that is read as both neutral and rigorous, right? Because that's key. So one of the things that's happened with the creation of these sorts of more scholarly spaces has been to move away from these more religious roots, and actually to be able to say, look, we are just a group of people coming along with a perfectly credible but different interpretation to this mainstream gender ideology, right? And you start to create a bifurcation that's also legitimized by these activities, right? This business of, conferences and events. And then what they also do is bring this idea that these are just similarly neutral and rigorous ideas into UN and other multilateral spaces, including most recently the COP negotiations around climate. The other thing is, of course, these organizations will apply for and in many instances get ECOSOC status. And then they will also create other UN-based formations. So we've got the Family Rights Caucus, which brings together countries and stakeholders that are interested in issues around strengthening the family. They'll come together in human rights groupings. The most sort of stark example is that every year in New York, there's the Commission on the Status of Women. These groups have come together and in the last few years have been running a conference on the state of women and the family. The acronym also makes CSW and is literally held across the street from the annual CSW. So you also get these groups moving into these spaces, moving in similar ways. Actually, if you're listening to them and you're working through what they're trying to say, because they present this sort of very professionalized and rigorous veneer, it's very difficult to tease out that actually they have this particular agenda. Now, they create their own information ecosystems that are also well-resourced and operate at multiple levels. And now, because of the rise of right-wing authoritarian governments the world over, these ideas are quickly becoming much more mainstream. Now, the idea that you might host a website or a conference on its own is not surprising. And just because right-wing governments are in power does not necessarily mean that everyone agrees with these ideas. But particularly in the context of development, where the legitimacy is drawn from is how these formations that engage with ideas around, for instance, sustainable development, or they'll use the language of, we're making investments in women's health across the life course, or we are engaged in, protecting human rights in ways that draw on data produced by the UN, the World Bank, the World Health Organization, or the OECD. And very often, these groups will identify many of the same challenges that many other organizations identify. So they will decry poorly resourced health or education systems. They'll raise concerns about financial crisis and uncertainty, or they'll be sort of lobbying around questions of security and peace. But what they then cleverly do is take this data or articulate these concerns and then set them out in a way to draw a conclusion that the only way to solve these problems is to return to more traditional ways. We have to stop all this gender ideology nonsense and spend our energy strengthening traditional family formations if we want to solve these problems.
Thank you, Lata. You mentioned a bit about it already, how these anti-gender advocates using the language of human rights to legitimize their arguments. Can you give us like a real specific example of how this tactic has played out in the global policy debates?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the big players in this space, I guess you could call them a think tank, is the Heritage Foundation. Now, if that sounds familiar, it's because they're the authors of Project 2025, and that has formed the blueprint for the current Trump administration in the US. Now, the Heritage Foundation made a submission. It's actually the same inquiry that we used our report to make a submission about around coloniality. So they also made a submission to the same inquiry of the UN independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity, who was looking for inputs for a report on colonialism and sexual orientation and gender identity. Now, they made a submission and it has all of these different features. So it's really interesting. And I want to read, to quote directly from it to give you a flavor of how exactly this is done. So, for one thing, the submission draws on the work of an academic at the National University of Singapore, right? So you draw on academic references, the voices of academics, and that gives you that lends it a real credibility and a legitimacy, and also lends to this idea that these are just rigorous ideas that are being expressed in this, in the ideas marketplace, as it were. And they're then very careful, right? They're careful to acknowledge in this submission that, of course, LGBTQIA people have rights, and those rights must be upheld, right? They're very clear that we want those upheld. But then they'll go on to say, and here I'm quoting directly from the submission, they say, and I quote, "The Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights explicitly protect the freedom to manifest one's religious beliefs in private and in public, as well as individually or in community. Regardless of prevailing sentiment among liberal elites, this right to manifest one's beliefs also applies to those who profess traditional beliefs about the creation of man and woman, the definition of marriage, and the sanctity of life." Unquote. So you can see how we get this slippage from, yes, we know that LGBTQIA plus people should have rights, but actually there are other rights that we have to also defend, i.e. the rights of people who believe that, believe in God, and that that the belief in traditional marriage between a man and a woman that might flow from this religious belief in God has to also be protected. And then what's interesting is that in the context of this idea of sort of global development, they will also set out that they are the champions of the independence and agency of the so-called global South, also by drawing on the idea of rights. So again, here I quote, "By promoting an ideological agenda that much of the developing world, particularly believers of major religions, finds offensive, the disproportionately powerful gender ideologues are undermining the human rights system they purport to advance." So this is a really interesting formulation, right? So what they're doing is saying, actually, we are the champions of the global South. So sort of implying almost like an anti-colonial, Western imposed set of ideas around gender ideology. We are here to champion global South countries that are have these particular religious persuasions who also have a right to express themselves in these global spaces, as opposed to just being told what to think by the gender ideologue. So you can see how the language of rights, support for the global South on their own terms, it all gets kind of mixed up. And this is then part of the UN's public record, right? If you search online, you get this submission, which is then seen as a submission alongside all of the others. And when you read it in the round, actually, there is a sort of intuitive response you might have. Well, yeah, no, it's fair enough. If people have religious beliefs, we should be protecting those too. And actually, it's a much more insidious sort of use of the language of rights to kind of say, well, actually, these rights have to be, these religious rights, effectively what they're saying, have to be asserted actually against the rights of other people to, have their gender equality respected. So it's very difficult to unpack that, because it's kind of muddied the water with this idea that, but an academic says, and so it's very, very difficult to sort of actually call that out, right? And they use these sorts of spaces to amplify these ideas, these UN submissions, the UN conferences. They'll use those spaces to amplify these ideas.
Just to close down on the last question, we want to close on looking at the future. We see how sophisticated these movements have become. So what are the most effective strategies for pushing forward? Like, how can progressive advocates reclaim this discourse?
Yeah, Karima, this is probably the most important question. And I think the answer for me is that we need better stories. What has been so striking for me working in this space for many years now is to see how right-wing actors and anti-gender actors in particular, they never just engage in single issues. It's never just climate or violence or financial security. Instead, they're very good at telling a story about the kind of world we all want to live in, or at least lots of people might like to live in. So they'll talk about security, they'll talk about there's a kind of a sort of nostalgia, a good old days. Now, that doesn't speak to everybody, but there are lots of people who might be struggling, who might hear that and go, yeah, you know what, things were simpler in my day, or, things were a lot easier when my grandparents were little or something. But they're very careful not only to tell a story, a kind of a holistic story about the kind of world that they envision living in, but they're also careful to set out who is to blame for things not going well. So in this case, it's all those pesky gender ideologues. It's all of your wokeness, the people who are, letting all the migrants in. So there's obviously the racism that underpins a lot of these ideas as well. But, those people campaigning for gender or race equality, people going on about LGBTQIA plus rights. These are the people that are actually causing your life to be worse. When the common sense thing, of course, this is what they'll say, we can all agree, it's just to work hard, know your place and live like normal, and I use that in inverted commas, normal and regular people in heteronormative, patriarchal and capitalist structures. And it's by doing that that we will have safety and security from all of this uncertainty. So I think the response has to be that we need to tell a better story. And it's not enough just to brandish the evidence, right? We're very good at that. Oh, we have data on maternal mortality, and we have data on all these things, which of course is really important. And I want, all of those indicators to get better. But I think it has to be tied up with a story about how we want to live on a planet that's not on fire or flooding people out of their homes and livelihoods. That we want to live in a world where people don't just work, but also rest and have fun and build all kinds of relationships, including family-based ones. And the thing here, I think, is really important to note that people committed to gender equality are mostly perfectly happy for people to choose to live in heteronormative families. That isn't actually the source of the critique. The issue for us is that question of choice. And as somebody who is an advocate of gender equality amongst a much wider collective, there is a recognition that there are plenty of people who choose not to live like that. And I personally want those people to also have great lives in which they are loved, respected, and valued as members of society also. And I don't think that a heteronormative patriarchal family, well, the patriarchy I want to put aside anyway, but I don't think that a heteronormative family structure is the only way to be happy. That would be a ridiculous proposition. That we understand that the root problem is inequality, unpaid and undervalued care, and that inequalities of all kinds, race, gender, sexuality, makes all of our lives worse. And it just so happens that we have empirical evidence to back that claim up too. But most importantly, we have to ask for nothing less than to reflect on how humans have always lived. Ironically, because we've never all been the same, or lived the same way, or ate the same things, or worshipped the same gods. There is no singular golden age for anyone. Apart from those who in any given time have been the most powerful, I think things have probably been pretty good for them. But we have, historically, as long as we've been humans, found a way to live together, to survive, to endure, to help each other. And I think for me personally, I want to tell a story about how we can be different, but also respect that and live together. And that requires a rethink of how the world works. But the current system is broken, right? Whatever we're calling it, whether it's about capitalism and how that links to notions of development or modernity, it's actually widening inequalities, and it's burning the planet in the process. So I think we need to tell a story that helps us to make demands for a systems change. I think nothing less will do. And I think that is the way we come together as a collective to make those demands.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lata, for this really eye-opening conversation. I think it really helped us see how understanding the history beyond the backlash is key to making sense of what's happening today. And then your insight are a strong reminder of what's at stake and why it's so urgent to reclaim space, language, like you said, new narrative, and policy in the face of rising anti-gender backlash. To our listener, thank you for tuning into Backlash Unfiltered. If you found today's episode thought-provoking, we invite you to subscribe, share with your networks, and check out our other episodes. So until next time, and I'd like to really build on what Lata says, so let's keep questioning, let's keep pushing forward, and let's keep the conversation alive.
And that's all for today's episode of Backlash Unfiltered, pushing forward for equality in times of change. For more information and resources, check the links in the podcast description. Thanks for listening and stay tuned for the next episode.